Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to speak. As you can see from my title slide, I've been given the task of talking about sustainable water use in the Arid Southwest. And so I have deliberately not focused only on Arizona here. I will mention it as I go along. Arizona is a very interesting place as far as water management, and I'll mention a few things as I go along. But what I will try to do this afternoon is give you, if nothing else, a flavor of some of the complexities that we're dealing with in the Southwest, and in particularly the lower Colorado River Basin portion of the Southwest. And as you'll see toward the end, the solution set or the pathways that we're talking about are the same pretty much wherever you are when you've got imbalances in supply and demand, or basically issues of sufficient water, whether it be quality or quantity sources that are the problem. So let me just mention, though, who we are, the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center. We are part of the NIWAR, National Institutes for Water Resources Network, and in fact, Doug's a fellow director of one of our members, and Reagan, who's coming up next, is also a director. And our network of water institutes, more or less, has been in existence for 50 years or more. And each of us is different. This is our mission, which is undergoing revision, but we really do work on critical water management issues and tie them to the real world and real world solutions. We happen to be located, that's a photo of our building. We're just slightly off the University of Arizona campus, not very far from the football stadium, for those of you familiar with it. And we happen to be in the old Boy Scouts building. And there used to be a big tall cactus that covered the stone emblem of the Boy Scouts, but it's died over the years and been blown down. And so the emblem now shows. And what is the motto of the Boy Scouts? Be prepared. And I happen to think that's a very good motto for a building that houses the Water Resources Research Center that's working on being prepared for the water future. So here are the questions. They're in your pamphlet that we were asked to answer. And it's very difficult to do justice to this set of questions, period, no matter what the geography, and also doing it for a large geographic area. So I'm going to give you some background of some of the issues that affect these answers, probably focus more on questions 1 and 2, but I will say something about questions 3 as well. But I teach a course in Arizona water policy in the spring semester. In fact, one of my students is here at the Congress today. And I talk about how important context is when looking at potential solutions or dealing with issues that you face. So I want to spend some time talking about context. And so first I want to talk about the U.S. And as is become abundantly clear, and you also all know this already, is that you can't paint the water management, governance, supply picture with a single brushstroke. Whether you're talking about the U.S. as a whole, whether you're talking about questions such as, this is a result of a survey we did a few years ago, does state law recognize the connection between surface water and groundwater? And these are the results we got. Don't worry so much about which state is colored which color. I've had state representatives come up to me and say, well, you didn't get our state right. This was the response we got. But the point is that we have a mosaic of situation here. And even within a state, we have a mosaic, different situations. Thomas just talked about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. We've had groundwater management practice since 1980 in Arizona. We have areas called active management areas where groundwater is regulated, where irrigated agriculture cannot expand over historical irrigation. And so the regulatory situation, the water supply situation, there is quite a bit different than areas that aren't colored, for example, in this map here. And then we have to remember geographically who we share borders with, and that in the Southwest, in the arid Southwest in particular, we have the distinction of sharing a border with Mexico. There are 4 U.S. states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, who share borders with Mexico. The reason California is not shaded in this particular map is this is one we use when we talk about the USMexico Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And California opted out of that for reasons having to do actually with the lining of the All-American Canal and other issues at the time that were going on. This is really important, and this is really important, this shared border with Mexico. When we, the 4 states, are addressing issues along our border, particularly here in the Beltway in Washington, D.C., because there's only 4 of our states. True, California is a significant one with more than 10% of the U.S. population, but it is something that a lot of other areas don't recognize and other people don't recognize, that, as was pointed out already, waters do not recognize political boundaries. And so there's a direct federal nexus, a direct reason for federal involvement here, but sometimes there are some challenges with that. I do want to mention with U.S.-Mexico border water governance and management, we do have an institution called the International Boundary and Water Commission. That commission is charged with particularly dealing with the implementation of the 1944 treaty governing the Colorado River and the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, and we're dealing with very asymmetrical situations here, but there's been a great history of the 2 countries working together. I'll just mention 2 examples. One of them has to do with the Colorado River, and just in Arizona itself, we have 3 major waterways that are considered binational, the Colorado River being one of them. And if you grew up in the East like I did in New Jersey, and you studied the Mississippi River and some other rivers, you think rivers flow from north to south. Well, they don't all flow from north to south. And 2 of our 3 rivers that are transboundary rivers flow from south to north, just in case you didn't know that. But the Colorado River, of course, is the one that's most written about and most well known. And there was a historic agreement to send some water down to the Delta. This occurred in 2014. It resulted from a series of negotiations and efforts, including the federal government, state governments, the federal governments of Mexico and the U.S. But I do want to note that a very significant driving factor in putting in place the framework that was needed for that historic Delta pulse flow was the earthquake that occurred in 2010. And because of that, canals were damaged. The U.S. agreed for the first time to let Mexico store water in Lake Mead, one of the important storage reservoirs that Doug already touched upon. And that set in motion a number of actions that led to things happening. So as we think about these pathways or solutions, sometimes it does take a driver like an earthquake or 4 years of drought in California to get the actions. We all say we don't want to do crisis management, but sometimes that is what it takes, and we have to keep that in mind, like it or not. The other example is the U.S.-Mexico Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, and there I have a picture of people talking. The other part we have to remember here, and I think Thomas pointed that out, that it takes people to take these actions. It takes the decision makers at all levels. It takes the stakeholders. Every person in this country is a water stakeholder. Everybody is a water user. And it takes a lot of dialogue for people to become informed, to be supportive of the actions that have to take place. We've been working for several years now on a federally authorized transboundary aquifer assessment program, and I think I finally can say with some confidence that the first of the 2 binational reports, which will be first ever reports prepared in English and Spanish at the same time, prepared truly binationally, will be completed before the end of the year. So the binational situation is very important to the arid Southwest. My assignment was not to talk only about the U.S. Southwest, but the arid Southwest. So I felt it was important to say some things about Mexico there. And then we have the Colorado River watershed, which Doug already pointed out, and I didn't have all the numbers Doug included, so we're quite complimentary here. I have the map here showing the boundaries of the watershed, circling to your left the Southern California area. Doug did point out about 40 million people depend in some way, shape, or form on the Colorado River. So you've got to look at that and say, that's over 10% of the U.S. population. That's a very significant watershed. The Bureau of Reclamation, Carly Gerla, who's the manager and director of these efforts dealing with the watershed study efforts for reclamation, looked at the projected gap between demand and supply going forward and projected quite a significant gap. And I don't want to talk a lot about that, but I want to again underscore the importance of collaborative conversations looking at, so what are these pathways? What can we do going forward? And just in, I think it was May of this year, the follow-on efforts to that study that showed a long-term gap looked at, well, so what do we do about these gaps? And so reports were issued. They're easy to download, and I encourage you to take a look at it. But I want to mention they had separate chapters on municipal and industrial water conservation and reuse, agricultural water conservation, productivity, and transfers. Transfers were dealt with. That's something people sometimes in the ag sector don't want to talk about that much. And then environmental and recreational flows. And the question one that we were given, particularly asked about the environment, and that's also often a sector for which water needs, demands, uses, whatever you want to call it, and there's some debate about what words you should use, are often either not evaluated, assessed, or recognized. And so there was an effort there to tackle that tough issue as well. And then we get to states, and also to tribal nations, to Indian tribes. And in the Southwest, they're very important. They have sovereignty when it comes to their water management, so it's very important to recognize that. If you're looking at pathways, a state can decide these are the pathways for us who are not living in sovereign nations, but the Indian nations have the opportunity to develop their own plans. And here I'm just showing you again a map of Arizona, a slightly different one, but then a map to your right that shows in goldish color the land area that falls within tribal nations. It's a large percentage of the area of Arizona, and there are a number of water rights that have been settled as well as unsettled water rights claims. So again, you have to take that into account as you look at your pathways. And I do want to mention, again, and these are the two handouts that I have over here, that many of us, including the Water Institutes and others, are working on engaging people in the dialogues to develop and identify these solutions and pathways to their implementation. So on your left is a cover of our last issue of the newsletter, which was dedicated to covering the topics that were discussed at our conference, our annual conference in June. And I would really encourage you, the handout gives you the website where you can download it. And I'm very proud to say that my staff and the contributors did an excellent job of recreating some of the emotion and the ideas that were expressed at the conference. And the gratitude and importance attributed to having this kind of dialogue, not just about contested water rights, but about what water means to different cultures and communities. And then, again, going to that gap, we focused our 2014 conference on closing the gap between supply and demand in Arizona and have a publication on that. And then we have the sub-state. And again, you could look at Thomas Harder's map, you could look at my map of Arizona. To your right is a photo of the Central Arizona Project Canal. That's a line canal that pushes 1.5 million acre feet on average of water uphill a year. The Central Arizona Project is the largest consumer of electricity in the state of Arizona, and it pushes water from near sea level to about 2,800 feet. And there too, solutions have been developed, sometimes not under the best of circumstances. To your left is a cover page of an article I co-authored in the Journal of the American Water Works Association about how a situation that initially started as a very troublesome one, delivering Colorado River water to the Tucson region, through the more standard approach of treatment and direct delivery had to be aborted because of problems with the quality of the treated water and burst pipes in people's homes. And our Plan B was implemented that relied on Arizona's statutory framework for storage and recovery that has ended up providing or enabling Tucson to have a very drought resilient system. So with that backdrop, before I get to some of the questions more directly, just wanted to put up a slide I often put up on what's entitled Complex Water Management Issues, Challenges, and then or solutions. And I put in pathways next to it. I really admire Doug for going to the dictionary to look up the word, the definition of solution. And you're using the word pathways here. We know what we mean. We're trying to fix our problems, and we're trying to fix them before they become so bad that we're in a bad situation. And I'll let you just look at the list here. The list is long. And for those of you who don't work on water on a day-to-day basis, just rest assured that there are those who do work on water on a day-to-day basis who spend every active moment working on these issues. It's not like we don't know that they're there, it's just the pathways to solving them are challenging. So let me get a little bit more to the point on matters related to the questions, and it's particularly focused on climate change, but whether it's climate change, whether it's climate variability, whether it's drought, we have situations of drought vulnerabilities in the Southwest, and a lot of attention is given to the Colorado River and the situation in Lake Mead. Colorado River Basin is in its 16th year of drought. Those storage reservoirs are way down. I'll show you a figure very soon about the levels there. But how many of you have been near to Hoover Dam anytime in the recent past? A lot of people. You know, you've seen the bathtub rings. You see the low water levels there. It's the symptom. Well, the states, again, are not, they know there are problems, and they're not just sitting there waiting for things to happen to them. And so I thought I'd give a couple of examples of how the states have worked together. And one great example has to do with the 2007 interim shortage sharing guidelines that were approved by the Secretary of Interior. These were developed in partnership with the states and other stakeholders, and basically set guidelines and regulations for regulating the two main storage reservoirs that Doug mentioned earlier, Lakes Powell and Lake Mead, in the Colorado River Basin, and also established criteria for declaration of a shortage. It was interesting that until 2007, there'd never been regulations dealing with what happens when there is an official shortage, or what is an official shortage on the Colorado River. Surpluses are easier to deal with. Usually that means you have excess water that you're distributing. And it wasn't until then that the guidelines were established. And then I mentioned already the 2012 Colorado River Basin Water Supply and Demand Study. The 7 basin states worked together with Bureau of Reclamation on that. Currently, there's some effort to include analysis of Indian tribes in this effort. It did not include Mexico, and I mentioned the follow-on efforts. And getting to Buzz's talk about the laws and the lawyers and so forth, is that most people think that it would be much better not to end up in court and have to pay a lot of money to all the lawyers and maybe not end up better off than you were. And so there really is a belief that there is flexibility in the law of the river, the complex series of laws and regulations, and that people should work together and figure out how to address some of the challenges, and they have, such as the shortage sharing guidelines have demonstrated. So this is a graphic showing the levels of the reservoirs in the Colorado River Basin. The two big ones are Lakes Powell and Lake Mead. Dick mentioned I'm on the board of the Central Arizona Project. Our official name is the Central Arizona Water Conservation District. And we get this graphic at every month's board meeting. I have a board meeting on Thursday. This is the one that came in our packet just the day before Thanksgiving. And it shows very low levels. I can't even actually read them on the screen. Lake Powell is doing a little bit better than Lake Mead. but Lake Mead has only been a little bit above the 1075 elevation level, which is the trigger for a Tier 1 shortage. The lake level actually went below 1075 in June of this year, but a shortage was not declared because it's the level in the August 24-month study that the Bureau of Reclamation does that determines whether or not a shortage will be declared for the following calendar year. And I'm going to skip over 2 slides here and get to the point. The reason we averted a shortage was because we were lucky. Mother Nature treated us well. The Colorado River Basin got a lot of rain. And these figures here, again, this is the first time I can recall in our board packet for the CAP are getting these kinds of graphics. But they show from May, June, July, August, September, October, what the rainfall looks like relative to average. And so the deep blue means it was well above average. And it's because May was a great month in the Colorado River Basin that Lake Powell got enough water. So under those regulations, more could be released to Lake Mead, and it pushed the water level up. Now, what about El Nino? We read a lot about El Nino, Godzilla and El Nino talked about in California and everything else. It's very interesting. This was a slide we were shown in the spring, and I asked to get it in the source of it because it shows the El Nino years in red, and on your left is the average April to July stream flow. And I'm not sure if that's at Lee's Ferry or where exactly that is. But look that there's no correlation between El Nino and the stream flow in the Colorado River Basin. So again, it could be a great El Nino year, but it doesn't mean it's helping you as a large basin. Now, another example of where and how the states and the federal government have collaborated is, again, dealing with levels in Lake Mead. And again, the theme here being is people are not sitting around waiting for bad things to happen. They're trying to figure out ways to avoid a shortage. And Arizona in particular is very concerned about shortage conditions, a shortage declaration, because the Central Arizona Project is very vulnerable to those shortages. Basically, in order to get the funding to build that project, to get the support of the California delegation, Arizona had to agree to take full shortage of that allocation before any water would be cut to California. So we could be cut a full 1.5 million acre feet if the shortages were severe and long and deep enough before California would be cut any water whatsoever. And there are others. Nevada experiences a little bit of shortage, and some others in the western part of Arizona experience some shortage. So we've entered into some agreements, we meaning water purveyors, Southern Nevada Water Authority, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the Central Arizona Project, the federal government, and some of these in order to bolster the level in Lake Mead, in order to keep some water in there, not have to worry about another state taking the water you've left and so forth, in order to keep the water levels up. If there's a shortage declared, Arizona has cut 320,000 acre feet. Remember, I mentioned the Central Arizona Project delivers 1.5 million acre feet. That's more than 20% of the allocation. And what gets cut is primarily the delivery to agriculture and then uses for some other purposes, particularly for storing water for future shortage, which makes sense. If you're having a shortage, you don't have the opportunity to store that year for future shortage. But this is another example of where Arizona has not just sat on its hands and not done anything. We've recognized our vulnerability. We have been in a situation, as the upper basin has as well, where it's growing into its supplies of the Colorado River. And we've been storing water underground for times of shortage, particularly for the cities and the municipal and industrial users that receive Colorado River water. This is a chart that shows water storage in Arizona over time, and the blue part is the part that the Arizona Water Banking Authority has stored on behalf of Arizona and some on behalf of Nevada for times of shortage. I don't have time to go into it here, but Arizona has a very robust statutory framework for underground storage of water. So as Thomas pointed out in terms of California, we've had a framework in place since the late 80s that allow for storage, and it's been used quite a bit. So getting to question 2, how can surface water and groundwater be managed in a holistic and sustainable way? This is a tough one. This is a tough one because the laws in many places do not recognize the connection between surface water and groundwater. And interestingly, though, although Arizona is one of those states that really doesn't recognize that connection, we've been able to do conjunctive management of surface water and groundwater through our Groundwater Management Act, through our assured water supply rules that require consistency with the management goals set out for those active management areas of safe yield. And we've been using Colorado River water and storing it underground and basically using these water sources conjunctively. And I have a couple of sources, references, if you want to learn any more about that. And I mentioned also about this question of does state law recognize the connection between surface water and groundwater? And notice in the arid Southwest, the states of Arizona, Utah, and Nevada said no. And so that is an issue. And here, this is just one chart from a study that we did based on the survey in which we surveyed the states, just a state official in each state, and asked to which following user groups do groundwater regulations apply and so forth. So there's wide diversity going back to that issue of the mosaic. Now, question 3, what monitoring data and regulatory mechanisms are required for sustainable water use? Well, don't think me glib here, but this is the big question mark, right? This is where we don't, we can either say a lot and also money's needed, and where we also need some more conversation. This happens to be a bookmark announcing our 2016 conference, which is #AZWaterFuture, Tech Talk and Trade-Offs. Again, going back to the point that we know what's in the solution set, but dealing with the trade-offs, what is the right technology, over what period of time, getting the people involved and having the discussions, this is where we are in Arizona. So, I just have a couple more slides, and I'll be pretty close to keeping to my 30 minutes. But this is a slide that I show a lot in many of the talks I give to audiences that are local audiences ranging to international groups, and some options and opportunities for sustainable water use. And this list is very similar to the list that Doug put up earlier. We know there's opportunities for demand-side management, increased conservation water use efficiencies. One of the interesting things to keep in mind here is that the cost structure for water utilities is not that dependent on the quantity of water delivered. They have a lot of fixed costs. And already California is experiencing this where they've cut back 25–30% of municipal water demands, and then they're finding out their proposals to raise their bills, and they're saying, oh, so that's the thanks I get for conserving water. And that's an issue for the water utilities themselves. They know this. And so sometimes if they don't seem like they're jumping up and down about conservation, it's because they know they're going to have to then go in for a rate increase to their governing bodies. And so it's something to keep in mind. And another thing to keep in mind here is that the demand side can be influenced by designs of communities, designs of buildings, and other things. And I think in the water community, we're not talking about that quite enough. And there certainly, from my perspective, is not enough cross-fertilization between the land use decision makers and the water decision makers. Most water utilities, their job is to deliver water on demand. And their job is not to say, well, you know, I don't think you should develop this way or that way or whatever. They may say, here's the cost of extending the infrastructure. It's really the land use decision makers and the planners for land use that have a lot of influence on that. The increased use of reclaimed water, particularly for potable purposes, is going to be and already is a large part of these discussions. Technology, desalination technology for seawater as well as brackish water. And also, I was in Israel, I go to Israel frequently. Reclaimed water desalination, a lot of times we don't put that in the same category, but when you get up to certain high enough standards, desalination, membrane filtration is part of the process. And then augmentation, what about importation, storage? Some people like to talk about weather modification. It's not my favorite thing to talk about. Water transactions, which Adam will talk about. And then financing is a really big one. How do these things get paid for? When you're in a state like Arizona where it's a large state, highly urbanized, you have rural communities that need infrastructure, need investment. They often don't have the financial base to support that. And how do you get it financed? Do you create some kind of infrastructure financing authority or what? These are all questions. And then getting back to Buzz's point about the water rights and takings, we in Arizona several years ago approved a constitutional provision to prohibit takings. It's very serious, and you can take things from people, without compensation. And the water rights, as much as you may not like them, I don't think in too many states they're going to change. So you have to figure out how to work within that framework. And then agriculture. I added this slide this morning because I just thought I wasn't saying enough about agriculture, because agriculture is often mentioned as the entity with so much water and how they use it. And I think there too, they often have very senior water rights. And if there are some things to change, I think we have to have a very broad discussion about what is our federal food policy. We can't tell people what to grow. We also can't tell people they can't sell their land for housing and whatever. We can't also tell them, well, you ought to use drip irrigation, that's more efficient. Other speakers have spoken to the implications of water use efficiencies in agriculture. But even there, what it will take is some money. There are examples of areas where trusts have come in, they've used money for mitigation due to salmon from the Bonneville Power, and they keep farmers whole to try something different. If you want to get somebody to try something different, think about coming up with the money to help keep them whole so that if their yield is not as great, they have the money to purchase the replacement. Of course, that doesn't necessarily help with the third-party effects if you're reducing the agricultural activities. And then finally, education and engagement. The institutes and Reagan's Institute has done a great job at that in Colorado. We work with others, California works, we're all working and trying to help educate. We're at universities, that's part of our basic mission, so that we can make good decisions for the long term. We have a project right now called Beyond the Mirage that is an innovative project that's going to be developing, and actually they've mostly been developed, 1-minute video clips. Instead of doing the booklet and asking people to read, we're going to do the 1-minute video clips that then you can stack up and make your own documentary little movie. And we're actually making a documentary also at the same time. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions.